that are struggling with this have a need to have that insecurity filled. Often they will look at that insecurity and think that if they do enough things, they'll have value. When you work in spiritual direction with someone who struggles with this, what they really have a hard time believing is that they are valuable for any reason other than what they do or what they have accomplished. It is hard for them to sit with the fact that God loves us because we belong to God, because our life is the creation of God's, and not because of what we do or what we've accomplished or, whatever the grade is on the imaginary report card that we're talking about. And so for a lot of people, and this is a real difficulty, either because when they're younger, they have their first experiences of failure. And when they have their first experiences of failure, they're really convinced that they're not worth anything because they failed. As we get older and we are more limited in the things we can do, we end up struggling with it because we are not sure that we have any value if we can't do all the things we used to do. And so, or if we have an accident and we're limited in some way as a result, we have the same problem. So the big spiritual issue for someone who struggles with this is, how can they be valued if they're not doing something? If they're not earning the right grade, if they're not, whatever that grade happens to be, if they're not, if they're not busy with doing the things that would give them value as they see it in the eyes of God. Any questions or thoughts, reflections? Have you known anybody like that? Gail said yes, but she didn't turn on her microphone.
Was Jill raising her?
I think Jill's drinking orange juice.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So,
I was just saying, yeah, I know someone like that.
it's actually a really hard thing in direction to get someone to drop that barrier of doing, and to find value in who they are without the doing part all the time. Now I want to talk about the antidote to pride, which is humility. And humility is a clear understanding of who you are, both the good as well as the not good. And it's a willingness to learn, to submit to training and discipline, and a willingness to repent. A lot of people worry about humility. It's a word we don't like in our culture. I think it's interesting that the last version of the DSM-V, which is the manual that therapists use for doing psychiatric evaluation, took out narcissistic personality disorder because they decided it was too common in our culture for us to call it an abnormality. So as a culture, we tend to be very narcissistic, and we tend to be very much invested in ourselves and our image of ourselves. And humility says, at one level in our heads anyway, your image of yourself it might call fraud on it. And so we don't want to go there, because if we go there, then we have to find some other sense of value and worth in ourselves. Pride fears in humility, I'll lose my place, I'll lose my confidence, and I'll lose my love. It's amazing how many people will tell you, if you start talking to them about this, that what they're really afraid of is that they won't have any value anymore, They won't have anybody who cares for them or appreciates them anymore. They're really afraid that they'll lose their competence, that somehow that inflation that pride gives us makes us competent. So because that makes us competent, then we can go out into the world and do things. But if we deflate pride, we're not going to be able to do those things. We'll lose the energy, we'll lose the effort, we'll lose all the things required for us to do things with competence in the world. And lastly, I'll lose my love. And I'll lose my love because no one will value me if I'm not doing things for them. If I'm not constantly showing them how I'm going to, I'm going to do something for them, or I'm not doing something for the world. Sometimes pride roots itself in, and like we talked about the young Jesuit last week in the sermon, who was really deeply invested in his ministry to the homeless, but it became the only thing about his life that was important, and he became so attached to the idea of being the best Jesuit who ever cared for the homeless anywhere in the entire world, that he could not separate himself from it enough to see the effects of his attachment to other people in his community as well as to the homeless themselves. Sometimes folks here will get on a real crusade and they're doing really good stuff, but they can't, their self-image is so invested in being the person who does really good stuff, that they can't see that the doing of really good stuff is not sufficient, and it's actually distorting their efforts to do something really good. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah. Well, I was going to offer another example, and that's Brennan Manning. I don't know if any of you know that name, but he wrote a book called Ragamuffin Gospel, and he wrote he was a Roman Catholic priest. He's been dead now for a few years, but he had an alcohol problem, and for a long time he did a lot of retreats across the country. And when he was invited to do a retreat, what he would do is he would check into the hotel that he was staying in for the retreat. He'd schedule a couple of extra days beyond the end of the retreat to stay in the hotel. And basically, after he got his work done, he would drink the minibar dry a couple of times. And in reflecting on it, he admitted that, he said, the thing that I didn't want to admit was that I was an alcoholic, and that was going to cost me appreciation in the eyes of other people. He said, ironically, once he came to grips with it and he went into rehab, then he said one of the things that he had to struggle with was that he began struggling with the reputation of being Brennan Manning, the recovering alcoholic Catholic priest. So pride, I guess what I'm trying to say is pride has a way of reinventing itself. And it doesn't necessarily need to swamp your life to become a challenge in some part of your life, if that makes any sense. And the other thing to remember about pride is, I think when we first start thinking about it, our reaction is to say, yeah, I know people who are proud, and we tend to think that it's the kind of struggle that mostly makes other people miserable rather than the person who's proud. but I hope you can see from what Natalie's been talking about, is it can also be a profound personal burden.
Yeah, fundamentally at root, one of the challenges for someone who struggles with this is that they become so self-protective in some ways that it makes it very hard for them to deal with the truth, like Manning with his alcoholism. One of the wonderful things about a 12-step program, if somebody sticks through it and gets through the 5th and the 6th steps, which is where most people stop and where most people relapse, because they require making a list of the things that you did while under the influence of whatever substance you were abusing, and then confessing that to another person. And most people stop there. They won't go beyond those steps. But when you do, one of the gifts that you get is the ability to tell the truth about yourself and about the situations that you're in. And that becomes a real freedom. You know, we were friends actually with a physician from here in Nashville who doesn't live here anymore, but was a recovering alcoholic. And he would say that one of the very best, and he had pride in spades. He said, I was pretty sure I was God before I went to medical school, and at Harvard, they confirmed it. And so, and that was his attitude towards the world, but alcohol became a big problem for him. But he said, it's so much easier to live when you tell the truth. And so he was a big truth teller, at least as he saw it. But he was always, he very rarely dissembled, which could make him an awkward friend because he would tell you exactly what he thought and not sugarcoat it. But there is a freedom in this that enables the kind of truth telling that that people need to learn to live with. Now, what I would say about a 12-step program, especially when they're oriented toward being more secular rather than working on the Christian roots of the program, and the program's deeply Christian in a lot of
Two
ways.
Episcopalians.
It's founded by 2 Episcopalians. Is that when you take the spiritual side of it out as much as the more secular versions do, then the issue is not that there's something larger than you in control, but it's very hard to talk about the love of God for each of us and to fill that gap that's in the life of the person who struggles with pride with the security and stability of knowing that they're loved and valued by God, no matter what they do. And I think that that can be a real challenge for some people. Let me see if I can get this slide to advance. So the true strengths of humility, or the strengths of true humility, are security of place, because you know who you are, and you know who you are in the eyes of God, which means that you don't need the mirror of someone else to tell you that you're valuable. It gives you a true understanding of your gifts so that you can acknowledge that you're good at this and you're not good at that, and you're really terrible about some other things, but you have a real understanding of who you are and what your giftedness is. Interestingly, people who struggle with pride often will deny that they have done anything of value, which is really interesting. It's a kind of false humility, which is a problem. Oh, well, I'm not really very good at this, but I tried. Or, oh, I didn't do anything, after they've just laid a 10-course meal on the table in front of you. Oh, well, it was nothing. It wasn't a big deal that I came and spent a week with you while you were recovering from the hospital. It was nothing. It wasn't an issue. at all. And that doesn't mean that you should go, look, I spent a week with you after you came home from the hospital. Why don't you care? Why don't you appreciate me for that? That's the complete opposite. But a false humility denies the giftedness and denies the gift of the things that you do to other people. And the other strength is that you're grounded in God's love. When you can accept the value of God's love and the grace given you in that foundation, then you give freedom to other people for them to react to you and to see you as you are, and not to support the image of yourself that you want them to appreciate. So is that making sense?
Take it down.
Yeah, take this down and talk about it a little bit.
Thoughts, reflections?
Natalie, this is Mike. Hold on. I'm been drinking something warm here. Yeah, I was thinking some of it, I think, comes down to like, everything is so, I think of it in terms of work. You know, you have to do something at work. That's kind of how we judge our value. So we can't accept grace in the sense of, you know what, I could go and sleep in yet tomorrow. I could mess this thing up at work. I could not care about this. And then I could still be paid and go to work. Would be like that grace. And it's hard for us to think of it that way, that, you know, even if I screw up, I'm okay. I'm not a bad person in that sense. And then I think that's where pride comes back in, is like you're trying to kind of define ourselves through it.
Well, and I think that's right, Mike. I think that there's an element of it that says, I can't screw up. Because if I screw up somehow, then I'm worthless. Or people won't love me. Or my image falls apart. You know, on Wednesday nights, we're talking about the early parts of Daniel, and Daniel has this dream where, well, he sees all of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom falling down along with a bunch of successor kingdoms and being succeeded by the kingdom of God. And what's kind of interesting about it and what happens later is Nebuchadnezzar has a really hard time accepting that his image, his eternal empire, isn't going to last forever. That he would be susceptible or subservient to anything else. And so he can't screw up. Well, he can't screw up, but he does end up going mad and has to be, and eventually recovers. But it's that kind of thing. It's that kind of, if it's not what I think it is, if I'm not what I want to project to the world, if I screw up, then I'm worthless. So now, I want to say this, and I'm going to let Fred get in here. All of us have an image we want to project to the world. Part of the habit of the heart is that, and in any one of the ones that we'll talk about, we have an image of ourselves that we want other people to see and think about. You know, if you struggle with deceit, which is the next one on our list, mendacity, I've been calling it, then you want to be successful. And what you want is for the world to think that you're successful. If you struggle with, let me think, if you struggle with gluttony, one of the things, and gluttony means way more than a problem with food, although that can be fundamental to it, then part of your problem is you want to be happy. And you want to live in a world that's happy. So you want people to see that you're happy. even when you're not. Okay, so we've all got images that we want to project to the world. The problem, or the challenge for someone who struggles with pride, is that image comes to dominate everything that they're about. And it supersedes their ability to relate to God or to other people. So it's a slightly different character in the image. It's not that we don't all have them. We do, but that the character of it is different. So what did you want to say, Fred?
Yeah, well, the other thing I was going to say, in response to your observation, Mike, is it's not a bad thing to want to live into certain ideals or realities. To go back to Brennan Manning as an example, there's nothing wrong with living into his priesthood. Nothing wrong, in fact, about owning the fact that he was an alcoholic. Yes, sometimes people who are prideful about images and things that just simply are not true, and can't be true. The sort of images of pride that prompt people to be masters of everything, or unexcelled masters of some one thing. I think that the antidote with humility is that it allows you to own your identity, but not to be so desperately tied to it that you have to make believe that God doesn't know the truth about you. And I think one of the really hard things for people who don't believe in God, but who try quite hard to be people of humility, is that unlike people of faith, there's no assurance that God, as kind of the ultimate arbiter of all reality, knows the truth about you. You have to, I know humble people who are not believers. The thing that I always feel a bit sorry for them, though, is that they have to kind of manufacture the humility all on their own. Because they can't kind of own it in God's presence.
What makes you nervous about humility?
You meaning everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I take pride in it.
That's what I was thinking, Howard.
Hey, Howard.
And I'm humble too. Thanks, Howard. Yes.
Well, there's some
there's a
serious
country
truth
song
in
there.
that statement. I wasn't just going for the laugh, because I've found that in myself at times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mike, did you have something? And then
Thanks,
Paul.
Howard.
Thanks, Hagar.
That's very true. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking the other aspect is that you kind of, it's like your lower self-esteem. You get back into what we talked about before, your self-esteem and how it ties in.
Okay, that's good, because that's about where we're going next. Paul, what did you want to say?
Yeah, just maybe how the pride in an accomplishment or something you've done can veer into false humility
Mm-hmm.
and pride. So that there's a place there you kind of have to be balanced with your pride. If I don't know, saying it the right way, that you can
Right.
you can end up going the wrong way. Your ego can take a hold of it.
Yeah.
It becomes part of you, and you're as that priest was concerned about. I don't want that to become the thing I'm known for. I'm really a priest who did this, but that's not my title.
Mhm.
I was-
How about the women in the group?
I was going to say something. I'm a woman.
Sure.
I was thinking about, you need to have, sorry about the background noise, clarity about yourself, which is a hard thing to be objective about, and I think that in and of itself makes me nervous. How do I know that I'm seeing myself clearly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
I think that's right, Jill.
kind of interested in that, and interested in any other responses that the women in the group might have, because when I've worked on this material in retreats, almost inevitably, one of the conversations we end up having is about the very particular struggle that women have with the whole notion of humility. Let me see if I can explain what I think is going on there, or what I've been told is going on there. And that is that for many women, and this depends a little bit on larger social trends, but it also depends a little bit on personal pilgrimage, the whole sort of journey that they've been on. The frustration with talking about humility is that they say to themselves, or they say in response to this conversation, I've been working so hard at being recognized for who I am and for what I can do. And now you're asking me to act less than I am, and to actively embrace as a good thing what in fact has been a bad thing. One of the first books I wrote was on women in ordination, and I interviewed 50 women in 10 women in 5 denominations. And I had this mammoth set of transcripts from these interviews. And I asked my mother if she would transcribe them for me, because she was blazingly fast as a typist. She typed 95 words a minute on a Selectric. And she transcribed these things for me. And she was the son or the daughter of a cabinet maker, grew up in a log cabin, literally with a dirt floor in Brown County, Indiana. Finished high school effectively in her sophomore year, because that's all they had to teach her. And didn't go to college because there was no money in that day and age for women to go to college if they didn't have the means to do it themselves. And my grandfather looked for work during the Depression at night so that he wouldn't be embarrassed by being visibly unemployed in the community where they lived. And I asked her what she thought of the transcripts at one point. And she said, the thing that really strikes me is that these women are asking questions that I never felt permission to ask. The thing I would say to the women in the group, that when we're talking about humility in this regard, it is not about owning subservience. Subservience is that dynamic in relationships, be they personal relationships or work relationships. That's just another manifestation of an order that is not of God. No one should be subservient to another human being, period. There may be cause to think in a responsible fashion of responding to someone else if that individual is working charitably and out of an appreciation that they too are not God, and that you are working together to journey into what God hopes for us. But the kind of humility that we're talking about is about power, grace, and giftedness that is given back to the one who gave it to us in the first place, and that is God. And that kind of humility is the ultimate kind of power, because it doesn't rest in us. It rests in our relationship with God, and it's God's to dispose of as God sees fit. I don't know if that makes any sense at all or not, and I don't know what that prompts by way of response, but I'd be interested in hearing what you think.
I just wanted to say that I'm trying to keep notes, but one of the things that you just said, power, grace, giftedness, given back to God who gave it to us, ultimate kind of power. That right there just completely shifted how I was looking at this. Because after last Sunday, I really, and I'm not trying, because of my pride, not trying to make this about me, but just going to throw it out there. I really struggled because I probably am having other things I need to identify too and aren't there. But I had to take it as this is a gift. If I can identify this and work on it, then hopefully I will be able to maybe have a little more self-perception. But also, I think I'm able to help my kids.
Mhm.
One of the things you led with this was, and not to say that dads don't help their kids, because that is important too. I have said to my children, don't ever let someone make you feel like you have to be less than you are. And I'm probably a little bit harder and more, forceful in that because of how I have been treated or not treated. But I guess just to wrap up, when you're talking about like how you see yourself, when I volunteer at school and there's new people that come in and I'm making copies and they ask me, oh, what do you do? And I say, or how does this work? Or where do I go? And I'll tell them and they say, what grade do you teach? And I say, I'm not a teacher here. I'm just a mom. And I guess what I'm saying is that I think in some ways, and it may happen for men too, that mom complex of I'm just a mom, or maybe I'm just a single dad. It's that it's not enough. And I don't know if it's making sense what I'm saying, but to get to be a parent is the greatest gift. So I'm trying to shift that focus of how do I balance? I need to work on this, but also it is a gift to be able to be in that role. Does that make sense?
Yes, it certainly does, Catherine. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think the important thing about understanding humility is it never means self-denial. It means self-knowledge. And it never means subservience. That's not humility. That's a kind of self-denial.
It can turn into self-loathing.
And it can turn into self-loathing. So maybe another way to look at it, let me ask you all this question. What does self-respect mean to you? And where is it lodged?
Is Evelyn trying to say something?
I don't know.
Maybe not. Anybody?
I was sort of thinking about the way you expect to be treated with respect.
That's part of it for sure.
just real quick, I was going to say, I don't think you can expect people to respect you if you don't respect yourself. If you, maybe that's a little harsh, but if you don't know your own worth or can speak for yourself and kind of hold your own, then I think people, not all people, but a lot of times you can be viewed as like a pushover or, oh, don't listen to them, you know, they don't matter. So I think that other people might be more willing to take you at your word if you feel the confidence in how you deliver.
Can I ask a question, Catherine? And you don't have to answer this. I just ask everyone else. I think that's probably a pretty common conviction. But from a Christian point of view, where is an appropriate sense of self-respect rooted? What is it rooted in?
I feel like part of it is in your understanding that your body is a temple of God.
Mm-hmm.
And that we're made in the image of God. Exactly, Evelyn. Yeah. And that's so important from a Christian point of view, because the modern sort of therapeutic take on self-respect is a kind of do-it-yourself thing. I have to actually figure out what that means. I have to kind of bolster my own emotions to defend it. And if somebody questions it or challenges it, I've got to produce proof that my respect for myself is appropriate. Hey, I may be a mom instead of a teacher, but a mom is still a really important thing. I may be, you know, I'm good at this, and here's the resume to prove it. Or the things I've achieved, or the goals I've managed to get to. And from a Christian point of view, and this is about preserving the well-being of everybody, everywhere, on the fringes of society and the middle of society, is to say, no, ultimately, it is rooted in the fact that you are made in the image of God, and that's enough, period.
I think there was a contemporary Christian music piece a couple of years ago that was titled "I Am a Child of the One True King," and I think that goes back to that same thing. I think we have a hard time imagining ourselves that way, but St. Paul says, in fact, through Christ, we were adopted as sons and daughters of God. So not only do you bear the image of God, you are the son or daughter of God. And you carry that dignity with you all the time. So self-respect is tied up in your sense of dignity given to you through the fact that you were created in the image of God and the fact that you are a son or a daughter of God. And so when you violate that dignity, how are you going to feel? You know, even if you don't understand exactly what you've done, even if you don't necessarily aren't in the habit of thinking about your own internal worth, your own dignity that way, if you violate that dignity, you're either going to feel guilt and shame for having done so, or you have to completely separate yourself from it and say, I don't have any, that's not where my dignity lies. That's not where my self-worth lies. Because that's the only way to cope with the way your behavior affects that sort of internal compass.
I wish I had known that when I was young.
Pardon, Evelyn?
I wish I had known that more clearly when I was a teenager and a young 20.
Me too. Jill, what were you going to say?
I was trying to wrap my mind around that concept, and I wondered if you could kind of rephrase it. The if you violate that dignity, kind of where you go.
Well, yeah, and I was struggling obviously a little bit with it. If you violate that dignity, okay, you're emotionally, psychologically, you're going to respond to that, because if it's truly who you are, if you understand that is truly the location of your worth, then having violated it, it, it robs you of a part of that sense of worth. And so either you're going to feel guilt, which is, sometimes guilt is appropriate. I know we have a culture that says I should never feel guilty about anything, but if you violate your own standards, guilt is appropriate. Okay. Not always standards imposed by other people, but certainly on your own standards. If you violate that, you're going to have to come to terms with it. It's one of the real gifts of, and I know I talk about this a lot, and everybody always looks at me like, I can't believe she's doing this again. It's one of the real gifts of the sacrament of reconciliation. That when you go through the sacrament, that gets healed. That piece of you that you've hived off and given away by violating your own dignity gets healed. Otherwise, the only other thing you can do is push all that sense of dignity away and find some other false sense of dignity. You have to locate it somewhere else. But if that's your core, and you see that as everyone else's core, that my dignity, my self-respect is lodged in who I am in the eyes of God, and you look at the world that way, think about the freedom in that. Think about all the weight you can put down. Because you don't have to carry that anymore. And Evelyn's right. I mean, I'll second it. I wish I had known it when I was in my teens and early 20s. I wish I had understood that value. I wish we did more to teach our children that that's the value that they have fundamentally.
Well, that's what I'm hoping to talk about in our next high school online session.
Yeah.
So and that's part of why I'm trying to figure out what I want to say.
Well, and I think we have to go there over and over and over again with adults as well as with young people, because we're worth so much more than we treat ourselves like we're worth.
And I think one of the things we really have to do in today's culture is that we've got to give our children that sense of it in a way that's independent of their feelings. Because children and teenagers in particular are subject to being oriented to their feelings and to entirely subjective notions of where their worth comes from. And in social media, you watch kids put that out there, risk it, and wait for a random selection of people, which includes bad actors and people who are vicious and degrading, to either confirm that for them or to disconfirm it, which explains a lot about suicide rates and explains a lot about the ups and downs that people in general, but young people in particular, have. And, we can own the legitimacy of feelings, but if our guidance to the kids starts with, how do you feel about things? And begins and ends there with some sort of quasi-therapeutic approach, the chaos that follows is just incredible.
I was just going to say, oh.
Oh, go ahead, Sharon.
I was just going to say, because I have teen kids and we struggle all the time with what's online that they have access to. It seems to me that making sure my kids know that their worth and dignity comes from God, and the whole comparison, I mean, we all do it. We see somebody else's posting and we have to remind ourselves that's their highlight reel. That's not their real life, right? If you're just comparing, if a kid or is just comparing their everything about themselves, from their grades to their appearance to where they go on vacation or whatever it is, to other people's highlight reel, and that becomes the foundation of their own self-worth, that's a problem. And I think that is just going to be a constant challenge for kids, for parents and teenagers, even themselves, because I think everybody that I know who's either on Facebook, has gotten off of Facebook, just realizes that if you compare any part of your life to what's online, you have to realize you're comparing it to a highlight reel.
Exactly. And we do that. We were curating our lives way before Facebook and Instagram in the stories that we told people about what we did and what we've accomplished and all of those things. So it's always been there. This just puts it front and center with pictures, which is hard. I got two other things though that I do want to, it's 10:06 and I do have to be at church at 11 o'clock. I want to talk a little bit about self-esteem, and I'm almost going to have to give you a definition, but self-esteem is not a bad thing, but it's rooted in two things. It's rooted in competence. You don't give people self-esteem by telling them without any achievements that they're competent and wonderful. You know, that self-esteem is not about dignity. That's your self-respect. The self-esteem is about competence, and it's about evaluating yourself with sober judgment. Okay, so it rises and falls. If you violated your own dignity, your self-esteem is going to be pretty low. Because you're feeling guilty and you're feeling shamed. Okay. But if you're living into that dignity, if you're living into what God created you to be, if you're owning all of those things, then your self-esteem is going to be pretty high. Because you know who you are, you know what you're good at, and you know what you're not good at. You know where you have faults, but you can accept all of that because you know who you are in the eyes of God. So self-esteem is not a bad thing. It's just when we cut self-esteem off from what it means to be truly, or what the goal and purposes of human living are, and the identity of a human being lodged in God, then self-esteem becomes a monster. Then self-esteem becomes, oh, this is the way that you have to keep me all blown up. You know, it's like a balloon of the Michelin Man. If you don't keep pumping something into it, or one of those terrible Christmas inflatables. I'm sorry, I know some of you have them, but if the motor's not running all the time and it's not pumping you up, then you just go. That's not self-esteem. That's something false. And we shouldn't be needing that. Self-esteem would come from something else if we knew what our dignity was. The other thing is self-love. And we have a problem with it. Christians tend to either think that self-love is a form of narcissism, or they think that self-love is absolutely essential before you can love anybody else. And neither of those things are true. They're both misreadings, misunderstandings of what self-love is about. And this is This is the best way I can explain it. One of the great mystics of the church used to talk about the fact that self-love comes when we love ourselves because of the way that God loves us. So that when we look at the way God loves us, when we look at what gives us self-respect, we love ourselves because that is what God has given to us, and that's the way God loves us and has created us. And in that sense, self-love then becomes love of self for God's sake, which is different than love of God for myself's sake, which is kind of like, I love God because of what God can give me or what God does for me. But that's proper, those three things are part of proper humility. Self-respect, self-esteem lodged in the right things, and self-love lodged in the right things. And the miraculous, wonderful thing about all of this is it heals so much of what gets distorted by pride. And it also brings such peace and such freedom to the person who's otherwise been struggling. Because once you get to that place where you know who you are in the eyes of God, that cannot be taken from you. And so once you know that, everything else takes an entirely different order in your life. And it makes it so much easier. Hard to believe, I know sometimes, but absolutely true. So, and it's 10:12, which means we won't get to church until 10:40, which is going to make Kathy really nervous. So I'm going to have to end abruptly. I'm sorry, but
It's a good place to start.
the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you and give you peace.
Good to
And
see
you
you.
as well.
Peace.
God bless.